So on this application, we have two buttons and they both have white text on gray background. Text is bold and we also have these round corners, so border radius of 20 units. And here's the XAML representation of this page. So we have a stack layout, and inside the stack layout, we have two buttons, which are almost identical. So except the text being different, background color, text color, border radius, and font attributes are exactly the same. Now, as your application grows in size, there are values that you want to reuse in different places. For example, this border radius here is repeated in two places. If tomorrow we decide to change this to, let's say 30, we have to update it in two places. So is there a better way? Of course there is. So every page has a property called resources. Look at the type. It's a resource dictionary. Now, initially, this dictionary is null for performance reasons. So we need to initialize it to a new resource dictionary. Now, we can use a string index to access objects in this dictionary. So we can add an element here, call it border radius, and set it to 20. And then reference this item in this dictionary in multiple places. Now in reality, even though you can do this in code behind, in 99% of the cases, we don't use code behind for this. We use XAML. But I showed you code behind so you have an understanding of how things work under the hood. So let's delete this. So I'm going to use property element syntax to set content page dot resources. Now, as I said, this is null by default, so we need to set it to a resource dictionary object. So resource dictionary. And by the way, IntelliSense is not helping much here. So make sure there is no typo. Now, inside this dictionary, we can put anything. In this case, if I want to store the value of 20 for the border radius, I need to store an int32. So we use x:int32. Once again, it's prefixed with x, which means it's part of Microsoft XAML. You have also seen xstring before, right? So all the standard .NET types are available here. Now here, we're going to set a key. So x:key. Let's call this border radius. And note that I'm using camel notation. So the first letter of the first word is lowercase, and the first letter of every word after is uppercase. And then inside this element, we can store our value, like 20. Now we need to reference this in multiple places. So I'm going to remove this. Here we need a special XAML markup extension. Remember XAML markup extensions? They're always between curly braces. Now we're going to use static resource here. And then we can reference an item in our resource dictionary. We use its name here, so border radius. Now I'm going to copy this expression and replace the other border radius with this one. Now if we need to change this value from 20 to 30, there is only one place to change. As another example, this time I want to define the background color for the button. So for the color, we use color element. Again, we give it a key. So button, background, color. And we set this to gray. Now here, I can replace this with static resource, button, background, color. And once again, copy and replace this value here. So this is what we call resource dictionary. Now, what if we're using these values on multiple pages? It doesn't make sense to define these resources on every page. A cleaner way is to define them in our application. So we have this app.xaml here. And you can see in the boilerplate code that we can define resources here. Just one thing, if you're using Visual Studio, the default project template does not create app.xaml. You only have the code behind, app.cs. If that's the case, just add a new content page with XAML and then change the content page element to application. Now for this demo, even though we have only one page in this application, I'm going to move these resources from main page to application. Copy, back here, and paste. So exactly like before, we use property element syntax to set the resources property of the application. And inside this element, we have a resource dictionary with 2 items. Now, even though I've defined this at the application level, I can still define them at the page level. And the values I put here will override what we defined higher in the hierarchy. So for example, I'm going to delete this border radius and change the background color to green. Now if we run the application, look, both our buttons look green. So we can define resources at the application level, at the page level, and there is also a third way. We can define them at the control level. For example, here, for this stack layout, I can use property element syntax to set stack layout dot resources. And any resources we define here will be available at this stack layout and all its children. Now, this is something that I advise you not to use because it's messy and makes it harder to maintain your application. Imagine you have a page with various layouts. If you're going to define resources at various levels in this page, then you have to scroll up and down to find various values. But if you always define them at the top of the page, there is one place to look for all these resources. So even though you can define resources at the control level, like the stack layout, or even the button, I personally advise you not to do this. So delete. Just one thing about using resources in the application. The resources you define here are initialized when the application is launched. And that means if you're going to define a lot of resources here, this is going to slow down the startup of your application. So use this only for resources that are used in more than one page. If a resource is used only on one page, do not define it here for performance reasons. Define it on that page.